could you reach the point where you couldn't go on as president?
After the war.
And let's talk about your chat with President Zelensky now. And I suppose the context for that is, okay, a change of government in the UK, but not a change of policy for full-throated support for Ukraine diplomatically and militarily, but the potential for a change of government in America and a vice president in the shape of J.D. Vance, who was nominated as the vice presidential candidate running mate for Donald Trump, who basically says withdraw support, and Donald Trump saying I could solve the Ukraine issue in 24 hours, which lots of people think would involve Ukraine just giving up the territory that Russia currently holds.
Yeah, kind of all of those things. I mean, firstly, you and I talk to a lot of politicians.
You more than me, but anyway.
But
thank you.
I've never talked before to a wartime leader whose country is at war right now, at the point at which you talk to them. And that's a whole other thing, really. Of course, it's a political interview, and you're talking about to someone with political objectives and things that they want to say publicly, and limits to what they might want to say publicly.
But you've got to decode what they're saying, and see what they're not saying.
Yeah, and here is a guy who speaks good English, but often will choose, because he's conscious that he's got to pick his words very carefully, to answer in Ukrainian too. So I'm doing an interview where I'm having a translator translating into my ear as we're doing it. I'm asking questions about corruption in Ukraine, which has been a significant problem for the government there, some of the losses they've sustained in the north and the east of the country. And then, as you say, the international picture. So 4 prime ministers in 2 years in the UK that he's had to deal with, but does make the point that actually a shed load might have changed in the UK in those 2 years, but pretty much the outlook on Ukraine politically has not. The whole business of how you cope as a wartime leader. And then, as you say, all this stuff about American politics and how that plays out for the future of his country.
And let's hear how that played out when you were speaking to him. And it's in a combination, as you said, of English and Ukrainian translated into English.
When Donald Trump said last year that he thought this war could end within 24 hours if he was to meet both you and Vladimir Putin, what did you make of that?
So everybody will be happy if one person in the world, and this person Donald Trump, can stop the war during 24 hours. The question is, what the price and who will pay? So
do you think you would pay?
I think in his, I'm not meaning that his idea to push us to pay. But if he wants to do it during 24 hours, the simple way is to push us to pay. Because it's understandable how. It means just stop and give. And forget. Sanctions out, everything out, Putin will take the land, Putin will make a victory for his society, for the world, and nothing, nobody in prison, nothing, any accountability, nothing, tribunal, nothing, zero. Yes, it's a very simple way. But we will never go on this, never. And there is no any guy in the world who can push us to do it.
Donald Trump this week has picked the man he would like to be his vice president, J.D. Vance, who has said in the past that he doesn't really care what happens in Ukraine one way or another. What do you make of those remarks?
Maybe he really doesn't understand what goes on in Ukraine. So for us, we have to work with the United States. And if new team will come, we have to work with them. We need their support.
Hard work, I guess.
Hard work.
Could be hard work to persuade
yes,
them.
but we don't afraid of hard work.
Tell me about how you find your relationship with the UK, because in the time since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, you've now dealt with 4 British prime ministers. That level of change, that level of turnover, can't have been helpful.
Britain showed leadership from the very beginning of the full-scale invasion. And every page of this story opened with Britain's leadership, and I'm grateful for that. Honestly, I have had powerful relations with all your prime ministers. Different in duration, true. With Johnson, it was longer. With Liz Truss, shorter. Later, there was Rishi, and the relations were different, but still, every single prime minister added something. Why? Because prime ministers are the face of the society. When one is not liked, the face changes. But disliked by whom? Disliked by society, and not vice versa. When the prime minister dislikes his people, like in Russia, when the leader dislikes those who elect him. This is where the difference lies between tyranny and democracy. That's why we're talking about a democratic society, a truly united kingdom, which stayed united around Ukraine, even when dealing with internal political and electoral issues. The kingdom stayed united around Ukraine.
I want to take your mind back, if I may, to a moment I remember very keenly. It was when you visited the UK in February of last year and you addressed the British Parliament just down the road from here. And I was there as a reporter watching, and you presented to the audience a helmet of a pilot, of a fighter pilot, asking for the UK's help, for Europe's help with planes. Here we are 18 months later. Has that promise been kept?
The jets haven't arrived yet.
Have you been let down?
I think not me, no. They let themselves down. It's them who are the respected national leaders. It's them who, having realized that we need those wings now to protect our people. We're grateful for everything we've been given, but if we are in this fight together, then everybody should do more than they can.
We all have our limits, we're all human. Could you reach the point where you couldn't go on as president?
After the war.
You feel a responsibility to...
Yes, that's why we have to finish with it.
You will serve until the war is over.
We have to finish with it, and we have to finish with him.
What news do you think emerged then from that conversation? I mean, it was an interesting conversation, irrespective of whether there was like breaking news in it.
So what caught my ear, firstly, just because I was at NATO, the summit in Washington last week, and so saw the moment where President Biden managed to confuse President Zelensky and President Putin, which was proper kind of grimace and look through your hands territory. He was very much sort of dismissive of that. Look, it was a human error. Much spikier about Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. Much spikier, I thought. And talking to colleagues from the Ukraine service and those who follow the conflict bluntly far more closely than I do, they were struck by his language around how this all ends. And a suggestion...
But he talked about the time when he's not president anymore.
Firstly, he talked about the time when he was not president, although he said that would only come after the war had ended. But he also talked about a solution, a diplomatic solution that might not involve the return of all of the land that Ukraine would instinctively regard as its own, which, speaking to our colleagues on Ukrainecast and others, felt was a subtle shift from President Zelensky about how this might end, and his willingness, or Ukraine's willingness, to talk to Russia and reach some sort of solution where, to use the phrase that the president used, the hot war, the conflict, the mass loss of life that's going on, is no longer going on.
But my diplomatic cogs are whirring in my brain now, and they're a bit rusty. But is that, I can't work out if that's an opening to Russia or that's an opening to Trump. And it helps him to do business with Trump to secure a bit more support from a Trump America, Trump White House.
And possibly a bit of both of those things, not least because he was saying he imagined any plausible, as he would see it, scenario where that could happen would involve Ukraine having pushed Russia back considerably from where they are right now. And of course, what's he going to need? He would argue to do that much more support from the from the West. The other thing that he was really keen to press, and he's seeing the Prime Minister and senior ministers.
Well, he's going to
in
the cabinet,
UK,
isn't he?
Indeed, tomorrow or on Friday, is this whole question, and this is really tricky, of can he have permission to fire Western weapons into Russia, but quite a way into Russia? Now, clearly, Russia is vast. So on the map of Russia, it wouldn't necessarily look all that far, but it would be extending well into Russia. In other words, can he hit the places that are launching the things that are landing in Ukraine? That's what he wants to do. But of course, if you're a Western backer of Ukraine, the dilemma has always been, how do you avoid this whole thing escalating and Russia being able to legitimately, as some people would see it, say, look, you, Keir Starmer, or you, Emmanuel Macron, are at war with us here because that missile is yours and it's landed in sovereign Russian territory. And that is difficult.
I'm just thinking back to other kind of diplomatic moves there's been this week. We saw Boris Johnson going to the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee and being pictured with Trump, and then posting on social media saying, and I made sure his backbone was still strong when it came to supporting Ukraine.
Yeah.
Sort of doing a bit of freelance diplomacy.
Well, yeah, and
or maybe not so freelance.
well, yeah, this is the intriguing thing. So quite often, pictures on social media, there is less to them than meets the eye. It struck me there was more to that than met the eye for exactly that reason. Because here you can have a guy who was Prime Minister, not before last, but before last, who clearly has an in with Donald Trump. And he had half an hour with him, in the days after the assassination attempt. And they clearly have there's a kind of kindred kind of spirit there between the two of them. They've spoken warmly of each other, etc., etc. And yet on Ukraine, it seems their instincts are about as far apart as you could get. But hang on a minute, what arguably, from a British diplomatic perspective, what a useful in to have a former prime minister who has that kind of connection, who is articulating basically the Keir Starmer's government position.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and okay, Keir Starmer and the government would argue that he has spoken to Donald Trump since the assassination attempt, but clearly they don't have the personal connection that Boris Johnson does. So it's not unuseful from the government's perspective that Boris Johnson, of all people, is out there in Milwaukee and making Ukraine's case.
And also just a reminder that the history books will judge Boris Johnson for three things: Brexit, Partygate, or whatever we end up calling that COVID period, and being like the number one cheerleader for Ukraine on day one of the invasion.
And exactly that. And two of those things are still live, aren't they? Because the war in Ukraine very much is. And he was the first of those prime ministers because, he was in office when the full-scale invasion happened. And then I guess, the whole question of Brexit and what that has meant and what it means is still, the book is not closed on it, even if it's a little less read than it used to be.
So meeting Zelensky, I mean, you obviously won't be able to comment on his security, but I imagine it is a little bit strange meeting somebody who, the Russians want to take out.
Yeah.
Is it like a ring of steel around him?
Yes. And without going into the specifics, there's a lot of security, and you would expect that. It was pretty obvious to those around us as we were arriving that something was going on. So yes, there's a lot of security, and they obviously take, as you might imagine, a lot of precautions. And there's quite a sort of travelling delegation with him. It's really quite something seeing him. We spoke for 40 minutes. Now it does take longer when you're simultaneously translating, and then perhaps he doesn't quite hear a bit of the translation.
That does seem a long time for somebody who's fighting a war. Bear in mind, sometimes when you see the Prime Minister, you only get 5.
So I spoke to the Secretary General of NATO today, and the interview was outgoing, yeah. Jens Stoltenberg. The interview was scheduled for 1:55 to start and was scheduled to finish at 2 minutes past 2. And sure enough, that is exactly when it started and it finished. And most of the interviews I do with prime ministers are 7 or 8 minutes. So, yeah. But then here is... He's got to keep... his
biggest weapon is airtime.
Yes, he's got to keep his and his country's plight in the minds of people, hasn't he? And of course, you might think, well, yeah, but he can go and talk to Keir Starmer at the cabinet or go and talk to European leaders at Blenheim Palace. But in the end, and he knows this, the biggest danger for him is fatigue amongst his allies. And that will come if a sufficient number of people in a sufficient number of countries, and who knows how this might articulate itself in the US presidential election, just conclude that this is a war that might be important, but is not important as important as lots of other priorities.